When it comes to the development of the breast, for anybody who didn't understand from Dr. Sherbini's COVID lesson and from the lecture that we took recently about it, basically the development of the breast comes essentially the complete development of the breast as we know it, come from two gastrulation layers. Now, these two gastrulation layers, we're going to say them first, which is the ectoderm and the mesoderm, or they call it the mesenchyme, the same thing. Now, for development of the breast in general, it starts off as an ectoderm, as a epidermis. Let me explain. So let's first draw here. A baby, a fetus. Tamam? We got a fetus, and we got a neck, and we have a body. Tamam? That's the only thing we're concerned about. Now, within the baby's body, when we're looking at, of course, an interior view, basically, do you remember the ectoderm and mesoderm layer? You got the ectoderm here, right? And then we're gonna draw in black color the mesoderm in red color, the mesoderm underneath. Basically, what's happening is that part of the ectoderm in black color is going to be thickened. It's going to proliferate and form a thickened part of the ectoderm, or to call it the epidermis, because as you know, the ectoderm will not eventually give rise to the breast, but it will also give rise to the epidermis of the skin. So this thickened part, or this thickened band of epidermis right here, is going to be thickened, not just in widths, but also in lengths. So if we were to draw it, basically, we would draw it in a line. But remember, this would be a very thickened line, right, like right here. But basically, we would have not one, but two lines of thickened epidermis that would not grow in widths but also in lengths. We call these thickened bilateral because there's two bands of epidermis that extend or elongate from the axilla, from the armpit, like right here. If you were to draw the arms real quick, from the axilla all the way to the inguinal region, the groin region. Tamam? Here I'll draw the axilla just to make sense. Now, this extension from this thickened epidermis, these bilateral thickened bands of epidermis from the axillary inguinal region, we give them a name. They form a line across the chest. We call these mammary line or ridges, because they look like ridges. Tamam? Now, these mammary lines, at some point during birth, some point during development, after, like, this occurs during the 6th week. So after 2 weeks, let's say after the 8th week, all of these mammary lines, they're going to degenerate. All of them. Tamam? All of them. Except the portion of the mammary line within the thoracic region. So we're talking about this region. So this portion of the mammary line within the thoracic region, it is persistent. It will not degenerate, but everything else should supposedly degenerate, because if it didn't, it will give you to an anomaly, right? Like polycylia or polymasia, for example. Now, this portion of the mammary line that is still persistent and still thickened, we will now look into it now. What happens to it next? So let's remove this entire section real quick. And let's delete all these, just so we can look at it in full detail. Perfect. Now, let's look at the thickened part of the mammary line, shall we? Let's draw right here an ectoderm. This boy is the ectoderm. And this boy in red color, so I'm going to make sure, underneath the ectoderm is going to be the mesoderm. Tamam? So this is going to be your mesoderm. Now, what happens on this portion of the mammary line that is still persistent within the thoracic region? Well, first, this thickened part of the epidermis some part of it is going to start to penetrate the mesenchyme. It's going to start to penetrate now the mesoderm. And basically what's going to happen is there's going to be a solid downgrowth. Solid downgrowth, yani there's going to be penetration of the epidermis to the mesenchyme, and it's going to form this downgrowth, a growth that's going downwards. Now, this portion of the epidermis, or this portion you could say of the mammary line, I'm going to give this a special name. We're going to call this the primary mammary buds. Buds معناها sack, like a bag, basically. Okay? Now this primary mammary buds is not going to stop from there. It's like a sprout, like when you give a seed and gives branches of trees eventually. This primary mammary buds, we're going to remove this, and it's going to give the rise to other buds. These buds are known as secondary mammary buds. So if you were to draw it, it will look like this. Okay? It will look like this. Multiple secondary buds. Now I did remove the primary mammary buds, but just imagine that the primary mammary bud will give rise to other secondary buds. Tamam? Tamam. So these are now secondary buds. I'll just say them buds. Which came from where? They came from the primary mammary buds. So you got the primary mammary buds that came as a result of downgrowth, solid downgrowth of the mammary line or the epidermis into the mesenchyme. And from these primary mammary buds, they will proliferate and give rise to other buds known as secondary mammary buds. Now, these secondary mammary buds, they are going to give you eventually what is known as the lactiferous duct. Lactiferous duct. You remember these? The ducts that connect the lobules to the nipple. They're going to give rise to these and to other branches, as is mentioned in the PowerPoint. What does it mean by branches? It means that not only will it give it lactiferous duct, I put an initial here, it also give branches. Branches, yani it will give alveoli. The alveoli, the cells within the breast that will secrete milk, alveolar structures like these. And small efferent ductules. خليك منهم. But if you were curious about branches, that's what they mean. Tamam? So let's remove alveoli and focus on lactiferous duct and branches. Now, how does it give rise to lactiferous duct and branches? Well, you see, I didn't draw any color, but if you can imagine it, just imagine it. Imagine if I put this in dark color, right? It's solid. These buds are solid, right? You're solid, tamam? Now, if they're solid, and let me give it a different color, or just speed up the process. There we go. Imagine this bud is solid. Every single one of these buds are solid, tamam? So, in order to give rise to lactiferous duct and branches, I have to do canalization. There's going to be canalization of these secondary mammary buds. And with canalization of mammary buds, canalization معناه I'm going to do this. I'm going to do this. Or let me just give it a different thickness. I'm going to do this. Canalization, like a canal. The canal where boats go through, under a bridge. This is what I mean canalization. I'm going to do an opening of these mammary buds, secondary mammary buds, to give me lactiferous ducts, which will connect to the nipple eventually. Tamam? Eventually to the nipple. Tamam? This is what it will connect to. So this is in one mammary bud. This is going to be the same for all of these. I'm not going to do the same for all of these, but it's going to be the same of all of these. So the secondary mammary buds are going to give rise to lactiferous duct and branches, especially lactiferous duct. How? By canalization of these mammary buds. And eventually, you're going to form a total of 15 to 20 lactiferous ducts. Tamam? And overall, that is almost the development of the breast itself. We didn't go talk about the nipple yet. Now, we finished the lobules. They pretty much form the lobules, as you know. But do you know what surrounds the lobules? Connective tissue, right? Look at this look at this breast. It's surrounded by connective tissue, right? And connective tissue that will give you fibrous septa, Cooper's ligament, or whatever, but connective tissue. And in between each lobule in the breast, do you remember fat? there was fat in between them. So the fat and the connective tissue, they're not going to come from the ectoderm. They're going to come from the mesoderm, or from the mesenchyme. If you want to be more specific, it's mentioned somatic layer of interembryonic mesoderm, but the same thing, from the mesenchyme. And it's going to surround it. Tamam? I'm going to draw it in a circle right here. It's going to surround it. Or let me draw it in pink so you can see it clearly. You're going to see this circle right here, this background over here is going to be connective tissue, and it's going to be fat that's going to surround what? The breast, as we know, or these lobules, as we know. Tamam? So it's going to come from where? From the mesoderm or the ectoderm, the connective tissue and the fat are going to come from the mesoderm. Tamam. Okay, now the final thing that we're missing at this point is the nipple. Now, let me remove this real quick so I can show you in a better way the nipple. So the nipple, see the nipple, it's quite funny because the nipple at first is not raised during development. In fact, it starts off depressed. How? Well, you see this portion, what did we mention this black color? It was the epidermis, right? Or this thickened epidermis. This portion right here of the thickened epidermis, this portion right here was going to give you what? The lobules and the selectivorous duct and so on. But this part of the epidermis right here, the upper part, this part right here is going to be, at the origin side of the mammary gland, is also going to be depressed. Tamam? It's going to be depressed. Now, when is it depressed? Tamam? When it's depressed, basically, it's gonna form a pit. Tamam? It's gonna form a pit. And this is what I mean by the pit right here. Do you see this space as a result? As a result of the, oh my bad. As a result of the depression of the epidermis, or the ectoderm as they say it, depression down below, is gonna form a pit. This pit is known as mammary pit. Mammary pit. Tamam? Mammary pit. This area right here. Pit like a space, like an empty hole. Basically an empty hole. Tamam? Which is going to be the primordium for the future nipples. And you know what? You want to know the funniest part? It's going to stay like that until birth. So for the rest of pregnancy, basically you're going to have no nipple. You're going to be, basically the nipple is going to be inverted, not exverted. No eversion. There's inversion but no eversion. Tamam? Until birth. And you got to keep those in mind for the nipples, as how will they be raised. So for before birth, it's not going to be raised, it's going to be depressed, the nipples. So what happens after birth? So this entire section is before birth. What happens after birth? Well, the baby, at first the nipples are not going to be raised, but shortly after birth, you see the nipples, they're finally going to be raised. Like that. And why is that? Why is that? Because, remember what I said about the connective tissue and the fat coming from the mesoderm that surrounds the breast? Well, do you remember that, of course, the nipple, the nipple is surrounded by by what was called an areola. The areola, which is basically darkened skin, right? Basically darkened skin right here, right? Darkened skin. Base of the nipple. Now, underneath the areola, there's connective tissue. Like we said, surrounding the breast. This part of the connective tissue, not all the connective tissue, but this part of the connective tissue, let's draw it. Let's draw you know what? We'll not draw it, but this part of the connective tissue in the breast, you can imagine this portion right here, that is underneath the areolar, which is in brown color. Just type it in brown color. This portion of the connective tissue is going to proliferate, and it's going to basically go this direction, upwards. Upwards for what? Upwards for the nipples. So this proliferation right here, this region of connective tissue underneath the areola, or I could say it right here, underneath the areola, tamam, are going to push the nipple out. They're going to raise the nipple out. And when they raise the nipple out, then you will see the nipple as you know it. Like when you look at a baby, with the body, you're going to see this point. Tamam? You're going to see this, not the breast, but you're going to see these points. These points are the nipples. The nipples are going to be raised. Why? Because there's proliferation of a specific region of the connective tissue underneath the areola, and you guys know the areola. Right underneath the areola section, the connective tissue surrounding the breast, they're going to proliferate, and they're going to push this mammary pit upwards and form a conical projection. A conical, yani like a cone, but yani rounded, yani not sharp like this, rounded. So conical projection from the lower half of the breast, and this officially completes yani the structures of all of the breast. Is it maturation? Well, for males we're done, but for females eventually is another development, but we don't need to know for that. But for overall, this is the embryological development of the breast in general. Tamam? And this is everything that we've mentioned. Tamam? Everything that I have mentioned, inshallah. Tamam? And of course, one more thing is secretion of which is milk that the Dr. Sherbini has mentioned before. Taman, in babies, there may be small amounts of secretion coming from the nipples. And the reason why is because breastfeeding, or not breastfeeding, no, before breastfeeding, during pregnancy, there is a transfer of basically maternal hormones like estrogen, progesterone, that are across the placenta barrier and goes through the fetal circulation, basically interact with this entire development and promote secretion of tiny amounts of, milk fluid or some type of secretion. They call it colostrum. They call it witch's milk, which is completely normal and disappears like a few days after birth. That's what it means by that. During pregnancy, I didn't mean breastfeeding, pregnancy. And that's basically it. That's basically it.